Saurabh Dube is a professor at the Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City. He's been there for a long time, but I met him first in Heidelberg University at a conference in, Saurabh, this dates us, 1997, so 24 years now. His work has been so influential, not just in my thinking, but in the fields of anthropology and history especially, and his books from Stitched in Time to his post-colonial encounters is a big thing for him, and we need to question him on things like this. But he's going to talk to us today on a topic: disciplines and the media, anthropology, sociology, history, modernity. And I won't say much more, I can, but give the floor to Saurabh to speak, and we'll keep questions. People can put questions in the chat, and then we'll have our questions after the second keynote and have them all together in a half-hour kind of round discussion. Saurabh, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure and privilege to be at this conference, although I wish I was with you in person. Thank you so much for the invitation once again, John, colleagues, and friends. My paper addresses questions of social structure and issues of development by turning to the past and the present of the human sciences. It makes a case for anthropology, history, and sociology, and partly sociology, not merely as modern disciplines, but as disciplines, archives, and thereby media of modernity. So I'm not making a case for these knowledges only as modern disciplines, but as disciplines of modernity. Through genealogical mappings, I explore how these disciplinary formations have at once inscribed and unraveled, erased and instated modernity's traces and tracks. At stake are important issues of the disciplines, archives, and media of modernity. Ever turning on apparitions of social structure as already haunted by developmental specters. My effort is to open up such compelling questions. Here, the very reference to disciplines of modernity and their archival tracks ever entail the media of modernity, a point that should henceforth be taken as already stated and understood. So I'm coming up with a rather capacious reading of, understanding of media, well, also disciplines and archives. Consider now that pervasive presumptions in the human sciences project its disciplines as taken for granted divisions of knowledge, whose relationship is then tracked as being vexed but constructive, so history and anthropology. Yet, what might it mean to rethink central strands of the human sciences as disciplines of modernity, bearing the archival tracks of modern disciplinary formations, protocols, and procedures? Emphasizing the relations between discipline and development, I shall focus here principally on anthropology and history, while raising questions for classical sociology as well as other inquiries. Let us begin with the meaning of discipline, which I derive freely from the Merriam-Webster online dictionary. As noun, a field of study. Rules governing conduct or activity. Control gained by enforcing obedience or order. Orderly prescribed conduct or pattern of behavior. Self-control. Training that corrects, molds, or perfects the mental faculties or moral character. And as transitive verb, to train or develop by instruction and exercise, including in self-control. To bring a collective under control. To impose order upon. Okay, so I haven't gone quote unquote, there's lots of quotations. So these are the meanings of discipline. Now, these discrete meanings and their key conjunctions have showed up the human sciences as overlapping, contradictory, split, and contended disciplines of modernity. As mentioned, I focus today on anthropology, history, and partly sociology, leaving aside formations of economics, politics, and demography, for instance, that mainly model their protocols of truth and method on the natural sciences. Needless to say, these nomothetic knowledges are equally formidable disciplines of modernity. The point is that disciplinary formations of the human sciences at large have at once inscribed and unraveled modernity's traces and tracts, forming the archives, disciplines, and media of modernity. The institutional emergence of modern inquiries in the human sciences occurred in the second half of the 19th century. Yet, the beginnings of these inquiries lay in earlier formations and contentions of power and knowledge, going back to the Enlightenment and its adversaries. Together, to be found are issues of enlightenments and empires, counter-enlightenments and nations, reason and race, settler colonialisms and racial slaveries, and genocide and violence. It is upon such scenes and sites, ever gendered, always sexualized. It is upon such scenes and sites that the different registers of discipline came to be at once entwined and unraveled within modern inquiries as intimating, disciplines of modernity. Such elaborations not only happen in decidedly contradictory and contended manners, but could be entirely imbricated in one another. This occurred across distinct yet overlapping social terrains, discrete expressions of authority and alterity. Turning to modern inquiries, such entanglements extended from the mutual making of the Enlightenment and the counter-Enlightenment through to the shared fabrications of analytical and hermeneutical procedures. Indeed, it was upon such grounds that the aggrandizements and conceits of reason came to be queried and exceeded, not only by counter-Enlightenment and Romanticist thinkers, but by contending strains of the Enlightenment, expressed by philosophers such as Hume and Kant. At the same time, such contentions variously coalesced with each other, variously shoring up the developmental idea of universal history. Here, contending imprints of universal natural history not only sought to name and describe. The contending imprints of universal natural history not only sought to name and describe, but to objectify and reshape social historical subjects. They reveal, wide-ranging disciplines of modernity as grounded in intimate formations of subject and sociality, authority and alterity. 4, finally, at stake in all this were abiding antinomies between static traditional communities and dynamic modern societies. These articulated, of course, other enduring oppositions between ritual and rationality, myth and history, community and state, magic and the modern, East and West, and emotion and reason. Such copulas have been imbued with contradictory value and contrary salience in rationalist and historicist, progressivist and romantic, analytical and hermeneutical, post-Enlightenment and non-Western thought. For long now, the copulas entered also the lives and meanings of everyday subjects and worlds that modern knowledges have not only represented and reified, but sought to render and rework in their own image. I'm suggesting then that the human sciences and their constituent knowledges are far from being already autonomous academic inquiries. Instead, they emerge as always acutely embedded in the world. That is, as worlded. They are, in a word, the disciplines of modernity, strewn with dominance and dissonance, shaped by the social and the spectral. Now, these weighty protocols of meaning and power in the human sciences have gone through key makeovers from the second half of the 19th century. The universities in Europe that had developed after the 16th century centered on philosophical and theological inquiry, yet as connected with worldly and physical investigations. Across the 19th century, this earlier, somewhat singular structure of the university was reconstituted as now made up of various departments, itself shored up by a gradual separation of empirical investigation from philosophical inquiry. The threefold bourgeois separation of key human activity into the domains of the market, the state, and society now came to be mirrored in the tripartite disciplinary division of economics, political science, and sociology. The main tendencies in these disciplines, along with those of anthropology cast in an evolutionist guise, imagine themselves in principally nomothetical ways. In contrast, the elaboration of disciplinary history as an institutionalized inquiry, for instance, followed a different course. Yet, understood together, these knowledges all variously emerged as disciplines of modernity, crucially shaped in the crucibles of meaning and power, authority and alterity. To repeat myself, these modern inquiries were elaborated amidst the light and shadow of empire and nation, bearing the impress of the distinction between the primitive stroke native and the civilized stroke modern. They variously expressed progressivist and romanticist sensibilities, analytical and hermeneutic tendencies, their disjunctions and conjunctions. I turn here to examples from history, anthropology, and sociology, bearing in mind the claims of the academic autonomy of disciplines that are themselves closely connected to the wide-ranging politics of the subject and the social. The institutionalization of the historical discipline in the latter part of the 19th century turned upon articulations of historicismus in Germany. Such historicism bore a double-sided relationship with the ideas and imaginaries of universal human progress. On the one hand, avowing hermeneutic and counter-enlightenment impulses, such historicist accounts acutely articulated notions of culture, tradition, and the folk, principally of the nation. They queried thereby the conceits of an aggrandizing reason, as well as of developmental schemes of philosophical history that they saw as leitmotifs of the Enlightenment. The point is that all this would allow for relatively pluralistic understandings of cultures and nations. On the other hand, following the influence of Leopold von Ranke, such historicism principally reinforced the exclusive designs of singular histories turning on a parochial nation state and its divisive power politics. The documentary dispositions, philological methods, and principles of historicist continuity meant also that most non-European others were banished from the pages of history. In sum, going back to the compelling influence of Herder, these traditions reveal the possibility of pluralist and relativist imaginaries and the presence of nationalist and racialist presumptions. They reveal institutionalized history writing as an inherently contradictory, internally contended discipline of modernity. At the same time, the elaboration of the discipline in connected Euro-American arenas meant that history writing bore the impress of nation and empire. Here, the recent pasts of dark and distant, chiefly colonial territories and terrains frequently appeared as footnotes and appendices to the master history of Europe. Here, the extending frontiers of the historical imagination in settler spaces against native peoples, for example, orchestrated their subaltern subjects through civilizational allegories. And what of the modern histories construed in colonized countries and emergent nations? These accounts were not mere reflections of European imaginaries. Instead, they were bound by particular protocols of proof and method, truth and philosophy. At the same time, such renderings of the past were also envisioned in the image of a progressive European civilization, often using unto their own purposes the hierarchies and oppositions of a dominant Western modernity. Once more, such were the contended contours, contradictory dimensions of historical inquiry as a discipline of modernity. Turning to anthropology, the sociocultural evolutionism characteristic of the discipline in Britain from the 1860s brought together two separate prior tendencies. In the first place was a study of the variety of mankind that had yet to free itself from the constraints of biblical assumption. Yet alongside was also an exploration of the progress of civilization for which a positivistic program was already well established. Now, the key question increasingly came to be the development of civilization, turning upon the unequal participation of different subjects in its inevitable progress. Here, linear, developmental, and progressive time formatively entered the core of evolutionary anthropology and its racial assumption. At stake were temporal sequences and hierarchical stages between the savage and the civilized. Basically, we're speaking not just of self and the other, but of hierarchies of otherness. At stake were temporal sequences and hierarchical stages between savage and the civilized in the framing of anthropology as a strident and aggrandizing discipline of modernity. Here, anthropology as a discipline of modernity was intimately bound to the conceits of empire and nation in institution, but also everyday arenas. Yet there's more to the picture than the familiar story. The search of diffusionist ethnology for the unity and variation of humankind had proceeded principally from biblical assumption. Now, even as key tendencies linked to biblical anthropology persisted, the premises of diffusionism came to be challenged from the mid-century by biological evolutionism and the archaeological revolution. All these developments came together in the querying of sociocultural evolutionism, including the presence in neo-guises of the German Romanticist tradition. Thus, even before the beginning of the 20th century, Franz Boas proffered a neo-ethnological critique of the comparative method of classical evolutionism, questioning racial and biological determination and intimating relativistic and pluralistic understandings of culture. This program insisted upon specific historical inquiry, detailed linguistic investigation, and grounded physical anthropology. At the same time, the work of Boas is better approached as straddling the dualism between progressivist and romantic traditions, interweaving universalistic and rationalist orientations with particularistic and emotional dispositions, which is to say, as at once entwining and holding in contrapuntal tension these contending schemes of modern knowledge. And so we find in anthropology a concrete discipline of modernity, one that anxiously upheld as well as uneasily upbraided, uneasily interrogated the racialized assumption of modern knowledge as bound to empire and nation. This excursus into the paths of anthropology and history has wide ramifications, extending to other disciplinary formations. Concerning sociology, for instance, the formative work of Emil Durkheim and Marcel Mauss, Uncle and Nephew, bears readings along the grain of its own contentions and contradictions, yet against the grain of the parochialism and presentism, indeed wiggishness, of mainstream disciplinary accounts. Here, the centrality of classifications and categories in the thought and writing of Durkheim and Mauss might be better approached as embodying a constitutive, not oneness. First, their discussions of primitive classifications are to be found a simultaneous braiding of positivist, nominalist, structuralist, constructivist, and reflexive positions. These positions were caught up in wide-ranging colonial epistemologies, as well as their somewhat spectral questioning. Indeed, the work of the two sociologists combines contradictory uses, asserting a colonial dichotomy in a new guise, while at the same time displacing previous methods of racial classification by insisting on intersubjective research. Moreover, consider that at the beginning of the 20th century, Durkheim and Mauss described the classification of their own European society as religious survivals. Yet, these very classifications, survivals, came to be seen by them as solutions to modernity's lack of, these very classifications came to seen by them 10 years later as solutions to modernity's lack of cohesion and reciprocity. Finally, Durkheim's earlier assertion of the clarity of modern categories was later followed by an insistence that it is in routine social worlds that the unimaginable is imagined. I'll just go over this. Durkheim's earlier assumption of the clarity of modern categories was later followed by an insistence that it is in routine social worlds that the unimaginable is imagined. In tune with these reflections, might we rethink also the formidable primitivist phantasms embedded in Sigmund Freud's imaginaries and Max Weber's iron cage of bureaucracy, each intimating an anxiety with progress in history as attributes of contended and contradictory disciplines of modernity. And in the paper which I've sent, I've sort of elaborated these concerns in relation to the work of Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown, but also tradition of also Boas and Boasians and forms of history writing, which are present in traditions such as those of the French annals. And we can leave these for the discussion. The point is that the human sciences just discussed found expression within a wider valorization of disciplines and disciplinarity at large in the 50 years following the First World War. Here, as an abstract noun, disciplinarity refers to a cultural ideal as well as values and hierarchies of knowledge production. As noted, the importance of disciplinary knowledges had begun at the end of 18th century, acquiring momentum from the mid-19th century. Yet all this had come about without the frequent use of the term discipline as such. As a distillation of the prior processes from the second half of the 1910s through the latter part of 1960s, disciplinarity came to be clearly named, celebrated, and sedimented in academic practice. At stake was the salience of four conjoint cultural values as underpinning disciplinary conduct, namely proceduralism, or the centrality of scientific method, disinterestedness as the pursuit of pure knowledge, autonomy, collective and individual, construing and curating the species for its own sake learning, and solidarity, social and personal, in the conduct of scholarly disciplines. Such construction and consolidation of disciplinarity in the 20th century might be better approached as intimating, aggrandizing, yet anxious processes of meaning and power. Along and against the grain of disciplinary conceits to be found here at once the making and unmaking of disciplinarity. And I provide a few very quick examples. I'm coming to the end now. To begin with, consider the counter-colonial endeavors alongside assertions of imperial interests during the interwar years. These were followed in the 1950s by persistent anti-colonial mobilizations, protests against the Soviet invasion of Hungary, and reckonings with fascist spars amidst an aggrandizing McCarthyism, a reworked capitalism, refigured social democracy, and totalitarian imaginaries. Together, in such context, there were endeavors to celebrate and to rethink the autonomy of analytical traditions. Such bids reified and reconsidered disciplines themselves. All of this could lead to static understandings of cultural action, but also newer engagements with social conflict, meaningful practices, and collective processes. On offer were formatively democratic tendencies, yet equally Cold War rhetorics across the human sciences. During the long 1960s, civil rights, radical student, emergent feminist, anti-capitalist, and anti-imperialist endeavors had key consequences. Needless to say, at stake were raging battles between capitalism, market, and communism, socialism, including as manifested in the Vietnam War. In these scenarios, assertive processes emphasizing human action and history making could lead modern knowledges toward increasingly conservative schemes, formidably structuralist analyses, and distinct avowals of agency. On the one hand, to be found were critical articulations of the interplay between structure and practice, rules and processes, social structure and historical action. On the other hand, these years witnessed also the rise of anti- and post-foundationalist assumption and analyses, which had wide ramifications for the social sciences and the humanities. Together, at stake were the disciplinary transformations of the human sciences from the 1970s onwards. These decades, since the 70s, have been marked no less by distinct historical developments. From the end of innocence of the Bandung era, as newly independent nations revealed their authoritarian and corrupt designs, the retreat of the institutionalized visions of state-sponsored equality with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise and decline of the magic of unfettered capital, the rise and decline of the magic of unfettered capital and the midas of the market, and the ascent to power in the second decade of the 21st century of plutocratic and populist regimes that avow entitlement. Such shape and shape inquiries. Absolutely, at the end, such doing and undoing of disciplines of modernity are worth staying with and thinking through further. On the one hand, the dichotomy between the primitive and the civilized that define the beginnings of history, anthropology, and other human sciences as modern institutionalized inquiries has apparently been left behind by salient strands of critical knowledge, apparently. On the other hand, in newer and older avatars, the antimony and its implications as part of disciplines of modernity continue to haunt our worlds at large. How are we to think through premises and promises of contending developmental visions and a priori social structures that ever intimate the ruins we inhabit? Thank you.
Thank you, Saurabh. Thank you so much. What a rich talk. Of course, I read it already. We've had the conference proceedings, but just hearing it as a spoken word piece is also profound and moving, in fact. My question for you to start with, and I have some questions already in the chat, and so I'll take them. One's asking me to read it out, but I'm going to ask you first my own question. So what I'm trying to understand, I think you're not arguing this, but can we imagine what another disciplinarity might be? I mean, instead of a European nuanced tangle of disciplines, should we even try to map, chart, inscribe, name, describe? These were all almost negative terms for you in the framing. A differently entangled, embedded worlding of disciplinarity, or are you against disciplinarity completely? Now, I know that you're going to say now, actually, your emphasis towards the end was on doing and undoing of disciplinarity and staying with disciplinarities of modernity, and you said it's worth staying with them. Can I ask you, what is it to stay in a undoing and doing and undoing? What does, you know, I kind of wanted to see some examples of doing that in more recent work. I mean, the uncle and the nephew you referred to is 100 years ago. Malinowski, 100 years ago this next year is Argonauts, right? This is crucial. You did mention some recent things, Bandung, the fall of the Berlin Wall and so on, which is definitely undoing and doing because it reinstated another kind of border, right? But Yeah, I suppose there's two parts of my question. What does it look like to be doing and undoing? To stay with that? How do you stay with that rather than fall into a new kind of disciplinary formation? And who can we look to working right now for inspiration for this? I mean, your preferences are historians of long ago. Who now?
Okay. Well, it's a counter question. So who, John, I think a part of my argument about disciplines of modernity is that, like modernity itself, they're necessarily contradictory. And I think there is a certain tendency, a sensibility we have as.
Still waiting for the second keynote to join. So I have a question that's come from Daniel Hellman, who's in Yap in the middle of the Pacific, and he says, right? So we're definitely pushing the borders of modernity now. Yap, from Yap, thank you for this wonderful talk with such great turns of phrase and ideas. I agree. Within this frame of the human sciences, what is the concept of peace and peace in modernity? Can you respond to this?
Okay, I'd actually like to link it up with what I was saying very briefly. So the point is that, when I speak of the disciplines of these modern inquiries as disciplines of modernity, they are about how there's an investment from the beginning, not just in observing and describing, but actually reshaping subjects. And this is my point is always that we cannot just simply bring our own preferences about what we like, because worlds, including disciplinarities, are larger than us. But the point I was trying to make is that despite all this talk about discipline, multidiscipline, interdiscipline, cross-discipline, we often forget, and this I've come to know from the historian of science, that disciplinarity is something which discipline actually as a term 50 years after 1910, and then it comes to be gradually unraveled. Now, this gets me to the other point that, you said my heroes. I don't have heroes, but nor do I necessarily have ready villains. Can we actually look at the disciplines in terms of their contradictions? And that's what I was trying to do. Speaking of contentions and contradictions right through. So in relation to this really important, very large question, I would say, can we hold together the possibilities of peace, and the constant incitements, instigations, and invitations to war? Can we hold these together rather than merely separating them, in terms of the way they're enacted in everyday life? Clearly, there are my preferences in terms of where I would go with this. But I think there is a problem with, for example, I don't like war, but seeing it as, like power, as a distant enemy, when we forget that it's a form of, that it's about intimacies, which are, which shape us, which seduce us. Is that making sense, or is that too much sort of weird stuff? So it's basically, and as I was trying to say, John, there's a problem which we have as moderns. That's when the thing shut me off. There's a problem which we have as moderns that we can't actually, we want to separate. We can't, we can't hold together. We don't wish to hold together what is categorically incommensurable, but actually exists together in social and historical and everyday life.
Sure. Daniel, do you want to come back to that?
Sure. Thank you for such an inspiring talk. I wonder, because disciplinarity shapes our thinking as well as our money. I know as professors, we get hired in a certain discipline. and that limits sometimes where we can work.
Mhm.
You want to talk a little bit about sort of the university structure and how that's changed?
Absolutely. I mean, part of it was implicitly present in terms of the larger transformations from what existed in the 16th century to what happened in the 18th, and then to this idea of specialization and the separation of philosophical from empirical investigations. And you can see, where I am on that. I don't like clear separations for that reason. But here's the thing. I think what happens when you have distant enemies, power, patriarchy, without looking at how they exist in terms of the textures, in terms of our own lives, human and more than human. I think what is often forgotten are the terms of our own privilege and our own entitlement. Okay, so that's where I'm going with what you're saying. It's not about, of course, it's a problem with the institutional structures of the university, and yet as the most radical of people, we can participate in what we can participate in making the university, which in most places, after all, is a corporation, right? We participate in that. Without registering that we're dealing with capitalism. We're dealing with a hierarchical form. So that's where I am with the institutional stuff. And it's actually there's a great paper actually written by an anthropologist from Britain, who's worked an anthropologist of science and scientific activity, who worked in the Max Planck Society. Okay, who worked in the Max Planck Society in Germany, and her argument basically is that women. She works specifically among women. That women scientists actually participate in the hierarchy of this place, not just because they are seduced, but the hierarchy is a crucial attribute, a critical attribute of the Max Planck Society, okay, in which the only way you can conduct, not just live, but conduct your experiments and live in that wider disciplinary sense and non-disciplinary one, by accessing and exceeding only partly hierarchy. Now, what do you do with that? What I'm trying to get at is, can we live instead of heroics? Can we work with pathos, which is all around us? Rather than, of course, I've gone on really nice marches, on Karl Marx's birthday with John in London, and that was exhilarating, including the pints of beer. But can we actually also consider that that there are moments of sociality, but there's also something spectral there? Can we actually stay with the kindnesses and the unkindnesses? Can we stay, with, I'm increasingly drawn to the word pathos of the worlds we inhabit and the institutions. Is it like just too all over the place, or am I making some sense?
No, I'm with you on the pathos. I don't know if Daniel wants to come back again, but I certainly feel it. I am concerned that by finding a way to stay inside, we are kind of, well, I always felt when this sort of the new metrics, the new disciplinarity, the hierarchy was being imposed, that if we didn't resist at every moment, we were going to be complicit in our own doom. And I suppose staying, even feeling that, is a kind of pathos, but it makes it very hard to continue on doing work that you think, well, this in some way also contributes to the very thing that is fueling the neoliberalism of the disciplines.
Yes, but that's true. But at the same time, the forms of questioning also lie precisely. So that's where the lack of separation between power and difference, between I think that's where the moments of questioning also lie. What we do in the classroom, what we can do in non-hierarchical ways, the kinds of questions we raise. And that's where my problem is with the Mandarins, who are the most radical. But when it comes to questioning their own privilege, their own practice, their own hierarchical schemes, it doesn't go there. I mean, I'm actually, as we wait, this is partly in response to your question, Daniel. On the 30th of November in the Colegio de Mexico, which is a very elite institution, although a public one, very small, there was a ceremony for Rita Segato, who's a very well-known Latin American feminist, who's worked a lot in Mexico, and she just received the most major prize for the Colegio de Mexico gives in the social sciences. And she was speaking about her work on feminicide in North Mexico, and she spoke of masculinity basically as something which is corporatist. And she had this point. She had a very important point to make. She said that it's not about the state, it's not about the connections. Actually, the aspects of masculinity as a corporation are about something straightforward. They're about loyalty. And the pathetic troublemaker that I am, I didn't say anything. But what struck me was in this wonderful in this outdoor ceremony, in this prize-winning architecture of the institution, actually I looked around, and it's the institution which is a corporation. And it's a corporation which draws in, which is sustained by loyalty. So, what I'm trying to, these are the terms, textures, the tenor of intimacy, which I would like to attend to. And it's in that sense that I'm speaking of Kethos. That, there's no, let's just get real. This is not to say that, I go into, that I go into extensive bounds of self-flagellation or anything. We've done that when we were much younger, that, there's no hope possible. But it's about accepting some of this and gritty living on, but always questioning our own privilege, our own conceits. And it's like speaking a lot, but it's actually, the proof of it is just in doing, and it can be done. Those are the people I admire, John, and not just academics. Those are not just historians or anthropologists. Those are the people who can do it. What I'm speaking about. Those are the people I admire. They're not quite heroes, but because they're fallible, but they're inspirational in their way.
Yeah.
We are waiting for the next speaker.
We are. He's having trouble
Right.
getting onto the Zoom. We have him now. So, Nikos, hello.
Hello.
Hey, we can hear
How
you.
are you?
I'm going to take my headphone off. I'm very good. I'm going to put my phone to the screen. So hopefully you'll be able to be seen by everyone and speak. So I introduce Nikos Papastergiadis, okay? I won't go into a lot of detail because we used up some time. The topic he's going to speak of is, there he is, it works quite well, is Cosmopolitanism, from the moral imperative to the impulse for eros and hospitality in the creative constitutive. Right, now Nikos has been, I'm sorry he's wobbling a bit, holding up the phone, but I want the phone to be near the microphone. And he should be able to speak from now. Nikos, you're on.
The normative ideals that cosmopolitanism rested on were not sufficient to build a new cosmopolitan world order. Now, those normative ideals were best outlined in the work of Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher of the 18th century. And he basically believed that humans were not cosmopolitan in and of themselves, but could only become cosmopolitan if they had cultivated the right moral outlook and developed a pedagogic structure that put them to cultivate their mindset and were governed by sufficient moral laws that would enable, in some point in the future, for us to have a rendezvous with cosmopolitanism. In other words, it was not our creative internal human capacity that made us cosmopolitan. It was the cultivation of moral reasoning that enabled a possible cosmopolitan future. Now, Kant developed a very sophisticated idea of how this process of cultivation and this connection with the moral framework could be put into place. But what I basically think is that for all its value and all its importance on emphasis on good civic governance and good interpersonal ethics and a clear sense of hospitality and solidarity with the other, that foundation of building a society around normative ideals of equality and solidarity and conviviality was insufficient. It never seemed to get us off the ground. And all of Kant's work, in a sense, was aiming towards a way in which we could mutually agree on the benefits of cosmopolitanism and to sustain that through good legal and moral structures. However, much of the end of the 20th century has demonstrated is that is insufficient. So, if the normative basis upon which a cosmopolitan world order is to be built is flawed, I then have given myself the question of saying, does that mean the whole project is weaker and flawed, or does it mean that we have to rethink the foundations and sources of cosmopolitanism beyond those normative frameworks? And for some time, I've tried to do that by thinking about the aesthetic foundations of cosmopolitanism and to supplement the normative with an aesthetic paradigm. And so I've set about trying to explore what would be the sources of an aesthetic version of cosmopolitanism. And it's been my hunch and my working practice for many decades now that artists are in fact some of the most brilliant agents of cosmopolitanism. And that when artists claim a sense of belonging in the world, they often and unequivocally and without any fear of contradiction say that I belong to this particular place, this specific territory, this locale, and I also belong to anything and everything all the way to the cosmos. So this right to the cosmos is inextricable in artistic articulations, and I believe it's inextricable because it's central to their sense of where creation also arises from. It comes from a specific place, but also extends to all of the cosmos. And I've witnessed and participated in many artistic events throughout my life and projects, and this sort of dual perspective, this double sense of belonging to a particular place and everything to the cosmos is, I think, is fundamental to their understanding of both their being and their sense of creation and capacity to create. Now, the question then is, how do we interpret? How do we make sense of the way in which creation operates in the world? And how artistic agents develop their creative capacities. So when I've turned to looking at the artists as agents of cosmopolitanism in the contemporary context, I can find many examples of artists doing work that, like Tania Bruguera, which is trying to make links with people with from different backgrounds to form an international migrant movement. I've seen projects by Francis Alice, which again also seek to build bridges between different communities. I've seen interesting works by Emily Jassir, who proposes links between diasporic and displaced peoples. So in all of these works, we see profound artistic attempts to enhance sociality, to build connectivity, to forge new forms of solidarity, and to expose the problems of society, to reveal the truths, to enhance the sense of care, wonder, and creation in all. Now, the moment you do that, we start to sneak in the normative categories that we found important and valuable in Kant, but in now through the back door of aesthetics, through artistic rather than political and moral governance, through artistic practices. So my theory is that, in fact, we're still relying on the interpretation of the aesthetic experience by justifying and validating and articulating it in terms of normative categories around solidarity, sociality, conviviality, hospitality, etc., etc. Or we could go the other direction and look at these artistic works in a very formalist way, which of course was one of the ways in which art history has developed throughout the 20th century, because the interesting thing is that many of the foundational texts in art history noticed that creation and art and cosmos were interlinked, inextricable, that artists were, in a sense, mediators of the cosmic in their practice. Now, we have been caught between two conflicting paradigms in how to make sense of that claim. One is the formalist one, that they try to sort of understand that claim in a purely disengaged way, and the other is a more engaged way, this materialist term, which I've just sort of says sneaks in the normative categories through the back door of aesthetics. Now, I think that brings us to a deadlock and a real problem. And so while those values, those normative values of truth, solidarity, empathy, conviviality are absolutely important, unequivocally central to my understanding of cosmopolitanism, I also think we need a supplement to them. Because what I've said from the beginning, it seems to me that they were insufficient to deal with the modes of attention and attraction that were necessary to bring cosmopolitanism to a stronger position as the world became more interconnected and more closer together because of the spirit of globalization. So to supplement the normative, I've suggested the introduction of the aesthetic, but the way in which the aesthetic has been interpreted by and large has reintroduced, in a sense, the idea of the normative. So how do we get beyond that deadlock? How do we fix this situation so that we can see the aesthetic in and of itself? Now, I've said that the tradition in philosophy has been fundamentally dependent on in modern philosophy and contemporary philosophy on the work of Kant when we talk about the philosophy of cosmopolitanism. And the two greatest exponents in the 20th century of Kant were, in fact, Jacques Derrida and Jürgen Habermas. Now, I think their projects, as valuable and as important and as interesting as they are, have not solved the issues that I've been trying to identify. And I think that we need to find an alternative, a counter-history, a different vein within the history of philosophy in order to articulate the sensory and aesthetic dimensions that I'm trying to pick up on. Now, when we read more closely the classical sources of cosmopolitanism in pre-Socratic and Stoic philosophy in ancient Greece, and pick up some modern figures like Nietzsche, Bergson, and Deleuze, then I think we might begin to find an alternative perspective and framework for thinking about the links between cosmos and creation. Now, just as I haven't got time today to go into detail with some of the artistic examples, although I've briefly mentioned three artists, similarly, I won't have time to really draw out this very complex and vast tradition that can rebuild the philosophical foundations and provide a new vocabulary for understanding the aesthetic dimensions of cosmopolitanism. So, given the limited time we have and the poor technology that I have been struggling with, let me just give a brief outline of the idea of the link between cosmos and creation in the work of one of these figures, which is Henri Bergson. Now, Bergson is an enigmatic and interesting character for this point. He never used the word cosmopolitanism in this direct way. He certainly didn't think that cosmopolitanism could come to us through moral reasoning. And he certainly didn't want to propose that the divine and the human elements which struggle in Kant can be overcome purely in the classical tradition of philosophy. So his solution was to try and get beyond these antinomies that are underpinning Kant's philosophy and to rethink the boundaries and the connections between mind and body, human consciousness and the spirit. And so Bergson put forward a whole set of propositions around the relationship between creation and identity, and he used some very interesting alternative terms to get to that, in order to reinvigorate the way in which the self and creation come into being. He talked about sympathy, intuition, and élan vital, a vital impulse. And I think it's this combination of sympathy, intuition, and the vital impulse which can open up a new perspective for thinking about cosmopolitanism. If we think about it in terms of the impulse, which arises when the subject is positioned next to another, when the relationship between I and thou becomes inextricable, when our connections to other things in the world becomes a flow, then I think we are in a different position for thinking about our relationship and capacity for being open to the world, and therefore not just creating, but connecting with others through the vocabulary of sympathy and intuition that Bergson developed, but also most fundamentally through this idea of the impulse that could open us and keep us connected to others. Now, again, for the benefit of time, I won't go into much detail about this, but I just wanted to sort of highlight that there are these alternative concepts and categories that may open us more to this experience of connection and emancipation and creation. Now, in conclusion, now apologies for going at this breakneck speed and all the problems, but just to recap, I've tried to say that the condition, the cosmopolitan condition that we are all confronted today is a paradox. Is a paradox that is caught between this heightened sense of possibility and connectivity and this deepening and depressing sense of the need to retreat and withdraw from others because of the problems that we now cannot dispute or that have been associated with globalization. Now, I've also shown, I think, briefly that the traditional perspectives in cosmopolitan theory, which were reliant on normative categories, have hit the wall as well. But they themselves were not fully sufficient to address the context and conditions that we have. And they certainly haven't worked in terms of drawing people's energy and connection and enthusiasm to embrace or to own the cosmopolitanism that is already within them. So I've tried to think about the sensory, the aesthetic, and the affective conditions as a ground, as a sources for reimagining and reigniting the cosmopolitan discourse for the 21st century. So this aesthetic, affective, sensory perspective is a supplement to the normative. It's not in competition. It's certainly not trying to cancel those important ideals of truth, justice, solidarity, conviviality, hospitality. It's trying to say that the way through and the way in which those categories are experienced are not through the moral framework that Kant presupposed, but perhaps they are better grasped as an impulse, as something that is already inherent in our capacity as a human, and something that arises from the interaction we have with others in that I-thou relationship. And that relationship, not just with others in terms of humans, but with everything, all the energies and objects that exist in us. I believe that this relationship to others and to otherness is central to all our artistic, and I would also extend it to scientific modes of thinking. And that therefore artists, when they make these contradictory claims that I belong to this particular place, but also to everything all the way to the cosmos, this is very similar to the way in which scientists also propose their sense of connection and inquiry with the world. And it's from such propositions that I believe that we can get a new way of regrounding and developing our not only our social connections to others, but also our sense of belonging to the cosmos. And that's not just an aesthetic and artistic and scientific claim, it's also an everyday claim. Bergson, I said that he saw the cosmos as something between the abyss of the origin and death. Sheldon Pollock saw it in the eros of everyday sociology. The ancient philosopher and emperor of Rome, Marcus Aurelius, said if we want to grasp this, stop thinking from the ground, but see the world from the cosmos, because from that perspective, then the triviality of everyday life may take on a new sense of meaning. But what they're ultimately saying, what all of these figures are ultimately saying, is that we can only see this if we adopt a perspective, a kind of field vision of the world, and that the impulse that is central to all our creation is also inextricably woven with the cosmos as well. So, in conclusion, what I'm trying to say is that cosmopolitanism is not something that can be measured and identified in those more explicit and tactile and unstructured and materialist ways. What we need is a perspective that is attentive to the ineffable, to the mercurial, to the element of interpersonality, and that therefore we need a variety of ways of grasping it, and not just by categorizing it in terms of how it operates in my particular culture or for my particular people or within this particular territory, but something that extends any of and all of those boundaries into a more unifying and all-embracing ways. So it's, in other words, when Bergson and others talk about being open to the world, what they're talking about is how we are already and always connecting to the flows that connect us and make us, and through which we operate in this world. My apologies again for not A, being there with you in person, but B, failing to somehow get through with this Zoom link. It wasn't for lack of trying. I've been hard at it with my technical advisor at the University of Melbourne all morning, but here I am, and I'm glad to have had the opportunity to present even in this hurry and limited way to your group.
Good.
And I look forward to any conversation or possible connection that we can have from here on.
Nikos, wonderful. Thank you so much. And apologies from this end for the tech. But we got it. I can't wait to show you the photograph of the setup that we've had with the camera stood up in front of the microphone here. Now you're going to get questions from me on the same thing that you're on. So I'm going to replace my head with yours, and I'm going to read out. So you're now in the little corner there. I've got to hold it still. Read out a question from Daniel, who's asked me to read this. Wonderful talk. I'm so glad you have mentioned aesthetics and opened the door on the role of the arts in this project. And this makes me think that aesthetics also implies anesthesia. Could you speak on the role of mind-altering substances and how this might help or harm the idea of progress in cosmopolitanism via aesthetics?
Well, I don't know much about mind-altering substances, and if I did, I certainly wouldn't be talking about them in public. But I have to acknowledge that there is an argument that says that much of Greek philosophy, in fact, all of Greek mythology, can be traced back to the relationship to the mushroom, its capacity for mind-altering stimulus. And the great Robin Groves, I think, makes this case very clear in one of the late editions of his mythology, his account of the Greek mythologies. So this sense of needing a stimulus in order to open up oneself to the cosmos, it is probably, to me at least, and again, this is speaking from a position of ignorance, I have to tell everyone, ignorance I'm speaking from, that the need for mind-altering substances is because of the shackles that the mind has already been imposed within through the ordinary and everyday process of territorialized modes of socialization. Now, it's very interesting to see why the mythologies were linked to the use of magic mushrooms. And it also is very interesting to think about how radical some of the early pre-Socratic and Stoic elements of philosophy actually were. The first people to use the word cosmopolitanism in ancient Greece were the Stoics. I mean, Socrates used it, but he used it in a very limited sense. Before him, Diogenes also used it, but in a more sarcastic and negative sense as well. But when the Stoics used the word cosmopolitanism, they talked about a very radical form of equality. And their idea of radical equality was really a break with all the restrictions that socialization and political control normally imposes on them. So they were saying that, if you're a cosmopolitan, you don't have to marry to express and hold love, because love will always keep two people together. But you don't control it and limit the beloved or the lover. If you're a cosmopolitan, you have access to cosmic thinking and creation. You don't need other institutions to tell you how to think. You don't need a doctor to tell you what is healthy. You don't need a lawyer to instruct you on what is legal. You don't need a priest to mediate you, because you are in touch with the cosmos, which is divine, critical, creative, and healthy, and being in harmony. So in that sense, these Stoics talked about a life that was above and beyond the regulative force of society. And it was a way of unshackling being from the, in other words, controlling dimensions of a territory, the pettiness by which people's lives were reduced. And therefore, to be open to the entire cosmos was a way of unshackling yourself, releasing yourself, to be anesthetic to the socializing and regulating forces of that particular territory, a polis or society. So in a sense, what is the purpose of taking drugs or to taking any mind-altering substance? It's to get high, to escape the gravity of our social conditioning. These are the terms also that Nietzsche uses constantly is attacking the philosophers, the moralists, and the petty religious people who are trying to repress and confine and ground people into the ground to keep them low. Whereas what he wanted was for people to get high, to get up beyond. And this is also a spirit that is expressed over and over again by others, that they say that they don't want to be tied down. They want to be open to the world and fly. So these flight metaphors and getting high are not coincidental. Anyway, sorry for that long-winded answer.
No, that's great, Nikos. We're going to run out of time, but I do want to link this to Saurabh's talk and so on, because there you wouldn't have heard it, but we were talking about the pathos, I suppose, that we feel when we're caught within disciplines, and he was arguing for sort of staying with them in looking for these moments of undoing and doing. And what struck me in your paper that really resonates well with that is when you talked about the cosmos and feeling little, recognizing the insignificance of our endeavors, whether they be management or hallucinations. They are still, on one planet among billions and billions of stars in the universe, right? The cosmos.
Exactly.
But I wonder if you find any affinities then with the work of Spivak, because she there talks about planetarity in very similar ways, and also about supplement. And what she wants to supplement is the vanguard party, actually, and not with affect or so on, but kind of there's an argument there that the aesthetic education she's talking about is one that reevaluates these values, that recognizes that the normative values you talked of, what were they, truth, and some others, solidarity, they're not all exactly the same. And your enthusiasm for them can't be the same. Your enthusiasm for solidarity in political organizations is of a different order, surely. anyway, I wanted to ask basically, whether that enthusiasm in the Vanguard Party or in political organisations is somehow of a different order than a more abstract cosmopolitan pathos or all this talk of affect. I don't know whether that's a question for either of you.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from, and I share many of the points. And as you know, you, me, and Scott have a very close connection. In fact, our friendship was forged partly in our interview that we did with Gayatri Spivak in 1985, 1,000 years ago. So she's been obviously a very important figure for all of us. Now, I haven't seen, but Spivak's concept of planetary and her critique of cosmopolitanism doesn't go as far as mine, I don't think. She's very astute at unzipping and showing the limitations and hypocrisy and flaws. In other words, pricking a lot of idealistic balloons that have been floated and pumped up with the name of cosmopolitanism. And she's exposed many of the hypocrisies and contradictions that have been played out under the banner of cosmopolitanism. And she's, however, when it comes to providing an alternative to cosmopolitanism, she's done some excellent work in terms of seeing how indigeneity has its own cosmologies and has its own alternative perspectives, which are often underappreciated or not even grasped in many of the mainstream discourses on cosmopolitanism. But then I think she also recognizes how what she calls the master, that's Kant, has also been only interpreted in a very selective and limited way. And so she reinstates the authority of that master, which is Kant. Now, in a pedagogic way, that's absolutely vital and absolutely useful. But I still think that there is a tension between the indigenous cosmologies that she's referencing and the mastering effect of the master's discourse of cosmopolitanism, which is Kant's. So she doesn't, I think, push hard enough from the former onto the latter. And in effect, it sort of disciplines the idealistic Western theories of cosmopolitanism by saying you don't even come up close to what Kant has to say. But it doesn't do enough, I think, to go beyond the Kantian normative model and to really open up the aesthetic models of education so that they can speak to the kinds of orders that we're starting to intimate in our current discussions.
Awesome. Nikos, we need to have 7 more seminars on this. This is especially getting you and Saurabh to talk together. I think it's been an inspiring session, but we have to come to an end because the other ones are going to start soon. I wonder if Saurabh, you wanted to have one last comment, if you're still there. He is, according to my...
I am, but in the dark.
Right.
So I really enjoyed the last talk. I wish the connection wasn't so fraught and short, but I eventually got to hear all of it. So, well, thank you very much.
I'm not hearing anything now, John.
Neither am I.
You didn't hear anything?
Speak again, Saurabh.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, yeah. No, I just wanted to say I really enjoyed the last talk and but the connection, so thank you very much. But the connection is short and fraught, and I can see Nikos' lips sort of thinking. So I don't know what's going on.
Saurabh, I think he can hear now.
who can, I mean, no, this,
We can hear you.
okay, no, I've been, this is the third time I'm saying that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, no, so I wanted to thank Nikos for his talk, and you know, and if there was time, you know, I would have liked to go into how certain kinds of cosmopolitanism did begin as you know, as projects of empires, rather than nicey things, but you know, that's in a very different direction from what you were saying. Although I you know, I asked that, I partly say that in the spirit of what you were of what you were speaking about. But let me not sort of go on. And it was a pleasure to listen to you. And I'm sorry that the connection was fraught and short and so on. But thank you.
Yes, and it's true that, you know, I cited Marcus Aurelius, who was an emperor. You know, so he wrote his famous meditations on the frontiers of the, you know, Roman Empire, defending it against the, you know, attacks of those marauding Goths and various other Northern Europeans. So, of course, you know, some of the ideas of cosmopolitanism were either at the expansionist or with the Stoics themselves, who were at the end of that Hellenistic era, where Alexander the Great's empire crumbled and limited itself. And similarly, when we look at, you know, in India and in China, some of the expressions of cosmopolitanism are inextricably linked with a global unity under one kind of form of leadership. Now, those ideas and those contexts, I think, are of course not coincidental, but it's also the context sometimes become a spur for the alternate. And that spur for the alternate is what fascinates me. And similarly, therefore, I think in this COVID conjuncture, to use the phrase of Nikos Papastergiadis, who I was on Zoom with just the other night, and he was, of course, referencing Stuart Hall, who, of course, is referencing Antonio Gramsci, which itself gives you a different lineage in terms of ideas of how, you know, territory, nation, empire crumbles and also can be reformed in different ways. So what I'm saying, that it's perhaps these moments of conjuncture that enable us to reclaim very, very fundamental ways of being in not only this particular place, but also with all that surrounds.
That's great, Nikos. Folks, we really want to thank our two speakers. You have the papers, if you have in the proceedings. If you haven't got them, you can email us and we'll get them to you. And read them together. I think they speak to each other in ways that, you know, I didn't see until I heard them again. So, because reading them separately, we're going to close this keynote session now. We're thanking you both, Nikos and Saurabh, so much for starting us off really well. And now we move to 3 sessions. So you can click out of this. We'll leave this meeting and we open the panel sessions. You have a choice of 3 sessions, which you'll see there on your front page of the Zoom. And yeah, thank you again. Everyone will virtually clap or whatever it is that we do in Zoom land. We need to find new protocols for that. But anyway, thank you.
Thanks, John. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right,
Thank
Nico.
you for saving the day, John.
Well,